Hello there. Welcome to Sword Fight Garage Band. Today I want to talk about the parts of a sword. When we're getting into fencing, it can help to know the different nomenclature around swords so that between instructors and students we have a common vocabulary to use when we're describing the different cuts, defenses, and different things that we might do with the different tools that we're studying. So beginning with this is a saber, and when describing the parts of the sword, I'm going to begin with describing the edge. The front edge, the edge that is facing towards us, is known as the true edge. Now on a saber, that true edge would be sharpened, while the false or back edge would typically not be sharpened, except maybe for a portion just behind the tip of the blade. Being able to tell the difference when describing your actions between the true edge and the false edge allows us to describe how cuts should flow and what we can do with certain parries. Also, when we translate our studies into a long sword or to a weapon that has an edge on both sides, we still want to be able to note what is the true and false edge when describing the motions that we're going through. But when we look at standard saber or sword like this, while the true edge is the one that's sharpened and the false edge is not, the other thing that differentiates the true and the false edge is the position of the blade when we are performing a cut. Generally, that true edge is going to be the edge that is facing in the same direction as our knuckles. When we perform a cut, it is the edge that is moving towards our fencing partner. We'll get into some of the differences in what that looks like with a long sword or other weapon that has an edge on both sides. But with a standard saber, our true edge is going to be the one utilized for the cut, and the false edge is that back edge that then is facing us when we are performing those cuts. We have the tip of the sword, which is utilized within the thrust. We can also use it for tip cuts. When looking at swords, of course, we have the blade, but the blade itself is divided up into a couple different sections. Nearest to the handle, we have the strong of the blade, and then from the midsection beyond, we have what's known as the weak of the blade. And those areas are described on that based on the resistance you can provide in attack with this blade. Meaning, if I have my sword out in front of me and someone is pressing near the tip of my sword, it's much easier for them to push that point offline. But if they're going to push near the hilt of my sword, it's much harder for them to move that offline. I'm much stronger in the bind in the bottom half of the sword nearest the handle than I am in the top half of the sword closest to the tip. So therefore, this is the weak and this is the strong. Where I grip the sword, I have a guard, in this case, a pommel, and a handle. Now, when I transition to a different weapon, in this case, a long sword, I still have a handle, a pommel. Instead of a guard, I have what's typically described of as a cross guard or quillions, and then I have the blade itself. There is still a strong and weak to this blade. It's just a larger representation of what can happen when I come into the bind. Still, if someone is pressing against this sword at the upper half of the blade, that is still going to be weaker than if they're pressing against the bottom half of the blade. So this is still the strong and this is still the weak. Now, when we have a sword such as a long sword or arming sword that has an edge on both sides, I still have what's known as the true edge and the false edge. It's not a factor of the weapon. Now it's just a factor of how the weapon is being used. What I mean by that is if I am in a standard stance, for example, vom Tag, and I am gripping the sword such that I have one blade facing towards my opponent, the other part of the blade is facing back towards me, and I inscribe a cut forward towards my opponent, well then this is the true edge, and this is the false edge. It's the back edge, the one that's facing me. However, when we look at the different manuscripts and treatises on longsword fencing, there are a number of uses for that false edge. And so, for example, you'll see within 3 of the master cuts, shifting into a different grip so that we can make use of either edge of the sword. For example, when I perform a zwerchhau, I am taking the sword and turning the true edge away and utilizing the false edge to cut into my fencing partner. Same as if I'm performing a Schielhau. I'm going to take the sword and turn it so that now the false or back edge of the blade is the one coming towards my fencing partner. Now that differentiation we'll get into when we get into the lessons about the Zwerchhau and Schielhau, why that is a helpful thing to do in those cuts. But when it just comes to being able to describe actions with the true edge or actions with the false edge, that's how we're going to know which is which. If I'm holding my sword in this position, this is the true edge and this is the false edge. If I turn my sword, but I'm still holding it in this position with my intent of making that cut, this is still the true edge, this is still the false edge. Still true, still false. But once I am performing in action where I am engaging the false edge, then even if that is turning and coming towards my opponent, I'm still going to continue describing that as an action with the false edge. Thank you for joining me today, and happy fencing.